Welcome everybody to today's Tech Talk. We're going to give a few more minutes for people to get logged in and then we'll get started. See everyone coming on.
Everyone's using their time efficiently.
Wow. Well, hello everyone and welcome to today's Tech Talk. We're excited to have our speakers here today. I'm Liz Fisher and I'll be the moderator. Just as a reminder, you all are muted so that we don't have any distractions from the presentation. And if you do have questions, please make sure you put them into the chat and I will get them to the speakers today. And with that, let me introduce you to today's speakers. Today's presentation is brought to you by the Central Chapter, and we have Dave Guru and Rachel Ruckert. Dave has over 34 years of experience in design, installation, commissioning of building controls, 15 of those years expressly tied to the craft of MEP. Rachel has over 21 years of experience in design, project management, coordination, and commissioning of HVAC systems. And the last 11 have been dedicated to MEP commissioning. So with that, I'm going to quickly turn it over to them and get to today's session. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Liz.
Hello, everyone. And there we go. So this is our personal introduction picture because what we see there with the Looney Tune group is pretty much what our commissioning team people is, picture us as or whatever, a whole bunch of flamboyant personalities with, all sorts of different things. Maybe at the end of this, you can kind of choose out of this group here where Rachel and I, go on those pictures. I don't know what those characters.
So part of what we like to do is give back. As we all grew up in this industry, we've had our own mentors and things that, people that have taught us that we've learned from. So we like to take the opportunity when we can to also give back, offer some of those learning opportunities and share some of our own lessons learned.
So with our presentation on our controls page turn, we hope that there'll be some immediate takeaways.
So we like to think of commissioning as we get to sit on the fence between design and construction. So it can be a really nice place to be. We're looking out for the owner's best interest. We're looking out for the entire team, but really our focus is the owner's best interests.
So probably everyone remembers this type of circle that had all the different disciplines: mechanical, electrical, plumbing engineer, electrical engineer. Well, we've actually come into the determination that this kind of circle of tasks completely applies to the building automation industry. There are so many technical experts within the organizations, how companies have niched people into certain areas that, it's a challenge. And oftentimes the person that they want us to potentially speak to the most might actually be the project manager, and being probably honest with our Circle of Trust group here, the project manager might be the last person we want to talk about because they're the ones that might want to RFI if we're asking that the set point gets changed from like 56 to 55 degrees.
Mm-hmm. Here we have another visual of what Dave just talked about. You can see, earlier, like in the 80s or earlier, you might have interacted with 3 people from the control standpoint. And as we progress to today, you can see how many people are involved in the overall process. So really, focusing in and finding that right person to talk to with those when you're discussing specific topics is important.
We love analogies. So technical instructions. As we're seeing there with the pictures of this military aircraft and then the little schematic below, there are technical instructions that the mechanics, even the pilots, all have to read. And these are processes that they have to follow in the strictest of orders, A to B to C to D. If anything gets skipped, they could actually be putting people's lives or even the equipment at serious risk. So it's very important that everything like per technical instruction is done to the T.
Mhm. Then there's the recipe book, what we like to think of as grandma's recipes. So you might add a pinch of this or a dash of that to get right to where you want to be. But in the end, we really think that, it's great to have the technical instructions, but to be able to have the ability to add a pinch of this or a dash of that to get the systems through the nuances of the buildings and the controls to operate in an efficient and effective manner as the designer intended.
It's kind of like what we talk about, giving the control contractor, a little bit of creative license. They're really the experts, and well, most of them are. Well, sidebar. So we, to give them the ability to use their talents or whatever is what we want them to do. But again, we want to have an understanding of how we're going to do it. Hence, the more detail of our page turn conversation.
Mhm. So here we have a sandbox, and our ultimate hope is obviously that everyone can play nice in the sandbox. We've kind of listed, a lot of the controls folks out there. This is not an all-inclusive list, but it's a lot of the controls folks, and many of them have package control options with parts and pieces. And
our list doesn't even speak to all the integration people, everyone from the, lighting, Russ Electric, from switchgear, so everyone has a piece of the puzzle that we, as the commissioning provider, again, are going to have to leverage their individual talents, the integrators, to make sure that everyone has an understanding of how things are going to be working.
So next we come to the controls page turn event. And really, number one, who needs to be invited? Well, obviously the control contractor needs to be there. They are the doers. They're the ones really making everything work. However, as Dave kind of mentioned before, it's not the PM that needs to be there, though they'll want to be there, and it's good to have the person who understands the finances. However, it's really that programmer or the field implementer. It's really important to have them at the table because they are the folks that are going to truly make the sequences come alive.
The next important person to be there is owner, of course, because this is who we're actually doing it for, and that's the most important piece. But another part of the owner group is actually their facilities team. Now, granted, not all projects have necessarily a facility team hired, but many times we're doing an addition or something like that on a hospital or other facility, and that facilities team is just a couple of hallways away. So having them in our meetings, number one, they can learn about what's happening for their new project, but just as importantly, we can learn from them on some of the nuancy things that are already involved with their building that can maybe save everyone a lot of bit of time.
Exactly. The mechanical engineer, this is their design that everyone is trying to bring to life. I'm using that a lot here, but it's their design. So it's really nice when they're in the room so they can answer any questions that the control contractor might have or that the owner might have, or if we're looking for clarification. So if they're available, it's really nice that they're present.
Mechanical contractor, another subject matter expert. They're actually the ones installing this, all this mechanical equipment. Also, they typically hold the contract to the controls contractor, so they should be there. So they have a lot of insight, again, to be involved with the control page turn meeting.
Right, and they provide equipment that sometimes has package controls. So that goes into the next one with the equipment vendor. So there's a lot of systems out there that have prepackaged factory package controls, and involving those equipment or those manufacturer representatives in these meetings, you have to have the right person so that they can truly understand how their system works, what can be adjusted in their system, what the control contractor can really do with their system. So otherwise you're going to be in a meeting where the control contractor is going to say, well, I don't do that. I just give it a set point and an enable, disable. That's all I do. So having the right people in the room, depending on what control packages you're getting, is very helpful.
The general contractor, well, it is their house really, right, that we're working in. So just out of common courtesy, they should be invited. As I kind of threw on as our screen displays there, I oftentimes throw like a concrete admixture joke in there because that actually perks them up saying, oh, something maybe I could be involved with. And then we go and switch to, again, a PID conversation or the use of ratio blocks and, the difference between direct acting and reverse acting. Now, the one thing that we are noticing more and more, and again, I'll call us from Wisconsin flyover country, so things are a little slower to get here, that more general contractors are hiring MEP specialists within their own organization. And those people oftentimes have more technical prowess. So it's really good to have them involved if they're available.
Right, they can be good advocates for the commissioning process as well. And then obviously the leader, the commissioning provider, it's important that this meeting remain with the commissioning provider, that it's facilitated by the commissioning provider and not by others. In our case, we like to have 2 people go to that meeting. One person is really kind of wrapping their arms around the team, digging into the nitty-gritty details, while the second person is documenting, some of the resolutions or questions or comments that are going on in that process. So why should we have a page turn? Well, Paris, France.
Or Paris, Illinois.
Makes a difference. Words matter.
And people do interpret those words differently. So when everyone's just looking at it on a submittal and just looking at those words, what do they really mean? So what we want to do is, again, have that pool of people in the room, kind of literally turn the pages physically and kind of read through the sequence of operation. It might actually seem almost a bit mundane, but it's really important, again, to hear the niches.
It is. That's really your opportunity to make sure you've got all the right people in the room. So that was the important first step that we just went through. But then you can walk through those details and make sure that everybody is on the same page. So there should be no surprises later. And the benefit to doing this in person and verbal, picture, we probably have all experienced this, sending a text or an email and it coming across incorrectly. So just picking up the phone if it's that sort of thing, getting together in a face-to-face meeting, using your words
are important. And then the last line there, it's really important as the commissioning provider, the facilitator, to make people feel comfortable, to let their guards down, if you will, or whatever, and speaking candidly. We're not there to attack a design or even attack what the control contractor is doing. We're just, again, wanting an understanding and for everyone to take away a learn, if you will, and then also just make our process better for when we actually get into the functional testing phase.
So in preparation for the page turn, it's really important to understand the design as much as possible. So page through those documents, the mechanical systems, go through those control drawings, review them, look at those schematics and look at the sequences and kind of see how they make sense. You're basically coming up with your list of questions in advance.
And the one reason, again, that a page turn is really important, and this is kind of part of the short story aspect that maybe I'm going to make a tad bit long, right, is that the control contractor is often regurgitating the words that the designer put out there, that this is how it's supposed to operate. So how is the designer, when he's actually reviewing the drawings, is he going to make a chink against the armor about the sequence, even if the sequence potentially doesn't quite make sense? And so those are the polite ways of us trying to call out, saying, how in fact are you going to do this? Like the last line indicates there, talk to the control contractor about discharge air reset, right? There are so many different ways of doing it. Trim and respond, we'll say simple outside air temperature reset, critical zone reset, there's, many different ways to, eat that Oreo or skin that cat. And that we want to, again, find out how it's going to be done. And then with the designer in the room, you can just nod, say, hey, that sounds perfectly okay. And this isn't all like have to write an RFI for this or that. I mean, we're just trying to get into the nuances and gain that understanding.
Right. And, to Dave's point there, probably probably 99% of the control submittals that we see are just copy paste the designer's words. So it is important to really focus in and talk about that.
So now, oh,
Yeah, go for it.
go for it. No, we usually speak each other's words.
We
here.
never take the same slides as we practice, so you never know.
So what we want to do now is actually go into some real true submittals and kind of talk about the things and the questions that we ask pertaining to them. So typically in almost every control submittal, the stuff that kind of resides up in front talks about like network topography and control power wiring and that kind of fun stuff. So, a whole lot of information there. So going to the next slide, what are the pertinent things to kind of talk about?
Right. For example, does IT even know you want to go on their network? So while hospitals and more critical type facilities might be used to these, remodels or even new buildings where their IT needs to be aware, you have some smaller projects where folks aren't even aware that you need to be on their network. So you're creating awareness for all of the people that need to know.
And then, how many static IPs do you need? That engineer way in the beginning, he's just making an assumption of potentially how many are needed. Maybe he might be talking to the basis of design control contractor, but more often than not, he's just kind of throwing darts at it, if you will. And control contractors, more and more, we're seeing that they have IP-based controllers, and they're saying, wow, if I put this on the network, that's less wiring that I need to do. And all of a sudden we're up to like 8, 9, 10 or more IP drops. And it's like, number one, we're going to have to get static IP addresses for them. And to the next bullet point, the technology contractor is likely going to want to get paid for those 10 drops, because he probably just had one circle with one T potentially saying here. So again, awareness, these are, our page turn is done, almost early on in the control phase, right after submittals are reviewed. So there's time to get this rolling so that we don't end up with not having this information at the time that we're wanting to functional test.
Right. And then there are so many projects where the control contractor is saying, hey, I can't do anything until the network's available. And we talk for weeks and then months regarding when the network's going to be available, because it seems more often than not that's delayed. So this is really to create awareness that, hey, just because the network is available, that doesn't mean everything's great and the work is done. That is when the work begins. So making sure folks are aware that when the network becomes available, that's when the work begins. That's when the integrations can begin. And that is when problems start to pop up. That's when you start discovering some of those issues.
So one way to combat that is we like to see within the control specification, the request to provide a temporary network, between supervisory controllers, so that the control contractor can likely start early or whatever and get his system up and running before IT becomes available. Because, sometimes, we don't have that clean, secure, and tempered room. So the IT people aren't even going to be putting their switches in place. But a lot of times that infrastructure is already there. So a control contractor, purchasing from Amazon a few $5, $10, $15 switches or whatever, they can actually use part of the infrastructure to create their own temporary network.
It's not necessarily as expensive or drawn out processes they like to make it seem sometimes.
No, and we have to work hard, because they still do, to your point, Rachel, they're trying to make excuses to wait. And we're out there pushing, saying, no, you can't wait.
Right.
So the same thing kind of holds true from a power perspective, right? Making sure that electrical equipment, pumps, hot water pumps, boilers that were on emergency power, that the control panels that are operating them are also on emergency power.
Right. Similarly, you have an air handling unit with the controls on e-power, but then what about your life safety dampers? Per code, they all need to close when the system's off, but you want them to all open when the system wants to turn back on. So maybe if those aren't e-power on UPS, having those dampers, have to think down the system. We always talk about analogies in the forest and the trees, right? So we've got a couple trees, but they all need to function together as a forest to make that work.
And then the need potentially of UPSs. And the other thing that we're doing and telling our control contractors is that we will be checking, and we want to make sure that they're creating as-built conditions of how they're looping their power to devices and how they're looping the communication trunk. Because, some application engineer, he's probably looking at a reasonable way of daisy chaining that, but field conditions might be different, so the wires get ran different, or maybe they actually put a repeater in there and they T-tapped off and branched. But we really want to make sure that they have an as-built, and we do that by working with them and by disconnecting the trunk to make sure what's downstream of that disconnection actually goes dead.
So here we have a design build steam to hot water heat exchanger. So you can see we've got steam piping with the 1/3, 2/3 valve into the heat exchanger, and leaving, we've got 2 parallel pumps. And then we've got for the hot water system, and then a DP sensor out there for control.
And then the sequence of operation there states things in a real, I'll call it generic fashion. And if you can look, and maybe the screen resolution isn't the greatest, there is not one actual number in there from a temperature perspective or pressure set point perspective at all. So we need to work to drag that kind of information out.
Yes, this might be like a grandma's recipe.
Absolutely. So an example here, it talks about the system being enabled, but doesn't really get into detail. So this is an opportunity as a commissioning provider to say, is it just a single set point on off, or does, most reheat systems certainly do have to run when the building is occupied. But is there the opportunity that we can potentially turn it off at night, to save some energy, and if there's a call for heat, then allow the system to come up.
So in the sequence, you can see that they indicate leg for the pump, which implies multiple pumps in operation. However, if there's multiple pumps, then do you indicate how they're going to stage? How will you bring on the leg pump? How will you turn off the leg pump? How will you address a failure? Or if they're redundant, then the word should be changed to standby. So, we say words matter. So having a clear understanding of what the intent is helpful.
Simple things like when they have multi-ranging transmitters, to make sure that people are adjusting them to the right pressure rating. This is oftentimes the case, like we'll say on differential pressure transmitters. Some of them have the adjustable range, and you do have to make sure that the range is high enough to be able to be greater than or equal to what the pump head is in the first place. Otherwise, that value potentially can be clipped and only hit the transmitter ceiling. The differential on like a 0 to 25 transmitter might be less than the 25, but if the head is 50, you again knocked off potentially 25 PSI. So again, it's just simple little questions that we're wanting to ask. And then we'll say goofy things on this. They showed a command on a condensate pump, and to us or whatever, typically condensate pumps are float operated, and so a status is great for 1 hour, maybe a high level switch if it had it, but we didn't even think a command was appropriate in this instance.
So depending, obviously this can vary depending on where you're from, but denoting the fail condition of your valves and pumps, in Wisconsin here, we might fail the 1/3 steam valve open. And so, just making sure that it's clear on how it should fail and that the right parts and pieces are in place.
And what we're indicating there, even though it's pretty much, we'll say, virtually a given, but again, I think it's important to verbalize, with the 1/3, 2/3 valve arrangement, is it going to be the 1/3 valve that's going to be opening first? Because we believe it should be indicated. And again, for us to probably do it day in and day out, it's like, it's second nature. But what you have to potentially think about, right? If it's in a hospital, you have to think of that third shift guy that they just hired 3 weeks ago, that there's a problem with it. He can read the sequence of operation likely and get a better understanding of
Right.
how it works.
So here we've got 2 boilers. We've got a variable primary system. So we've got our 2 pumps in parallel again with a DP sensor out there in the system.
What we really liked about this graphic or whatever, we smiled because the control contractor, even though they weren't providing that equipment, they were responsible for wiring it. So they actually showed it and made it a part of their schematic. So we actually thought that was a smart and a good ad for the control contractor looking out for the client. This sequence of operation actually provided considerably more detail than, we'll call it the design build one that we showed earlier. It indicated within the sequence, you know, when the system should actually start. It provided the temperature set point values for the outside air reset schedule to the heat exchangers. But one thing it didn't mention or speak to as clearly is minimum flow. But this is a point again that we have our pet list, if you will, that, you know, where is the location of this minimum flow control valve? You know, I think many people have learned that having a minimum flow valve just located in the boiler room oftentimes causes short cycling versus having it way out in the system to allow more circulation, or even the use of good old-fashioned 3-way valves, right, to provide more volume of water and actually some pump bypass.
Maybe some selection of 3-way valves. Your whole system doesn't have to be that. Maybe you pick a handful of cantilevers or something.
Yes, and then boiler efficiency.
Yeah,
right?
boiler efficiency.
I was
So,
you could have this one.
so you know, oftentimes boilers like to operate, you know, they'll find that they're most efficient when maybe all 3 boilers are running. So now when you have 3 boilers running, you have 3 times your minimum flow versus if one ran to capacity and then brought on the second. So you really need to have your minimum, your bypass valve. You have to be able to accommodate that minimum flow in whatever manner that those boilers are going to operate.
And then the emergency shut-off switch, right? I mean, depending on the size of your boiler system, they are required by code. Code actually indicates that these boiler switches should be located outside of the boiler room, but leaves an exception, if you will, or variance that they can be located immediately inside the door if it's kind of like a public corridor. But still, as a courtesy, you know, you really should be making your AHJ aware of this because they're the ones that are still the final judge on where that goes. But again, it's just it's an important conversation to make sure, again, excuse me, all of the players are aware of its final location.
Right, and obviously that has to be at every door that exits or enters into that boiler room. And the AHJ would definitely be the one to give the blessing to put it inside the room.
This is just, again, examples of the designer and then the control contractor. They used the proper wording for standby, that it was a, you know, 100% redundant pump. The second pump would not have to run. But this is then another good place that maybe it didn't get into much detail is, you know, how are we going to just swap the pumps, you know, based on, is it strictly timing, you know, gets above X hours, which could be at, you know, on New Year's Eve, 2 in the morning, minus 20 degrees outside, you know, which would be a bad time to decide the pumps to switch? Or is it kind of predicated on, yes, run time, and then maybe an announcement that it's going to swap now at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday? You know, many ways of doing this, but again, an understanding, and this is a great place again also to leverage if you have an owner's facility person there on what their standard operating procedure already is.
Right. Oftentimes there's that really nice happy medium between these two where you say, hey, at Tuesdays at 9 a.m., or second Tuesday of the month at 9 a.m., we're going to look at the runtime, whichever pump has the least runtime will now become the lead. So there can be happy mediums on those. So here we have a package rooftop unit, and this is the schematic that was created. Number 2 down there in the notes is actually a really nice note. So this is the 1%. I think I said before that 99% of controls contractors seem to just copy and paste the sequences from the designer. Well, here's a 1%er. So they put in the note, the unit sequence of operation to be written and programmed by the equipment manufacturer. And this is because it's a packaged unit, has factory package controls, and they know that. So it was really nice to see them take that step.
And because before we flip to the next screen, to accentuate on where Rachel just went, is the engineers oftentimes, they might write a pretty robust sequence of operation for a pretty cheesy rooftop unit. And if everyone's going to be writing that information, including the control contractor, when we come to functional testing, if we're not told otherwise, we're going to really hold the control contractor to, this is how you said you were going to make it work. So this is why, again, we were happy that they didn't show that, because now this really allowed for a better conversation during the page turn, because we did have the vendor there, we did have the control contractor there, so they all kind of worked it out. But now to our next picture pertaining to this, is that if people are going to show a schematic, they should really show it accurately. You know, they should do, my second page here kind of is a proof of the pudding, but you know, we as commissioning provider had to review the submittal to actually find out what was in there. You know, when the system kind of talked about a return fan, but the submittal said it's just a relief fan. And the gas burners, you know, typically on rooftops are on the leading side of the fan. They show a mixed air or freeze protection device like in the mixed air, and that just, you know, here in Wisconsin doesn't make any sense at all. So, and then they even mentioned an airflow monitoring station, which again, we couldn't find that anywhere also. So between looking at a schematic, which should be done accurately, and then the next page, please, you know, going over the submittal, you know, to make sure how things operate, and the devices that are being provided are all little cross checks. Which leads us to
basically making sure that the designer's words and the submitted words reconcile. So here they're talking to the designer saying discharge air temperature reset will be based on return air temperature. And they talk about dehumidification strategies. But when you look at the packaged units sequences, that's not what they're doing. There's a disconnect between them. And so having them both in the same room and indicating how this is really going to work, but also just to take one little jaunt off of this, you can get a sequence of operation book from the rooftop manufacturer, and they might have 4 different ways spelled out that they can do morning warm up or a discharge air control or a static pressure control. But we don't want the final record submittal to have all 4 of those in there. We just want to say, which one are you using for this project, and just bring that into the document.
And the same even held true with this. The designer's sequence of operations spoke to return fans and return fan static pressure, yet it's a relief fan. So the engineer actually made a little mistake here. And again, we just have to leverage to make sure that the unit is going to operate as intended.
Here, this goes back to the safeties that Dave sort of touched on in that schematic page. So the designer's words indicated that low limit and supply high static would shut down the unit, and that those safeties would be resettable at the indoor temperature control panel in the unit. So the equipment vendor did not indicate safeties, and nor did the control contractor. So it's really determining who's providing and wiring these devices. In this case, both contractors dug in their heels saying that it's the other person's responsibility, right? It's better to find this stuff out at a controls page turn than it is at the end of the project. But having said that, there are a lot of packaged rooftop units that do supply a low limit and a static pressure high limit off of the supply fan. And in those cases, they're resettable at the unit. However, in this case, they wanted them all resettable at the indoor temperature control panel. So really making sure that they're just automatic resets, and then maybe having a latching relay down at your control panel is a way that you can get by with that. So you still have that manual reset at your control panel in the building.
Nope, that's perfect.
So even if the unit is gas, we feel very strongly that there's freeze protection on units. So placement of that freeze protection is different. As Dave mentioned in the schematic, having it downstream of the air handler, or the rooftop unit, because in that case, what we're protecting are the hot water coils in the duct downstream. We've had too many instances where the unit has failed, like the gas went out or something, and they're pushing the cold air down, and you freeze the coils and you cause almost more damage.
I guess where I was going to jump in
Sure.
on this, from, when we're involved on a project, and this happened to be an example of one that we got involved in the construction phase, these kind of people digging in their heels sometimes comes up to writing RFIs, change orders. The engineer has to actually indicate what their direction is. They might say, hey, I indicated I wanted this and this. I don't care who provides it, just provide it. And if any time there's sticky situations, it seems to be, again, just with, relatively cheesy rooftop units.
Right, and I would also say on this, before you push the button, I would also say that it's important to, we prefer hardwired freeze stats, because, if we've had experiences where they argue to provide like a software low limit, and we've had those situations where, on, of course, a nice design winter day, they lost communication and other things, and so they ended up freezing a bunch of coils. So if it was hardwired, that would have helped.
Would have likely saved
It would have
a
saved,
bigger mess.
yeah.
We can skip this
Okay.
one. We're running shorter on time.
Okay.
So something simple as a VAV box, there's a lot going on with this also. So I think we want to just do a little deeper dive on this. Control contractors have oodles and oodles of set points. And sometimes they even have a little package solutions, and depending on what mode, but you don't even think it's going to operate in, it touches that set point and puts it to some crazy CFM that no one's ever seen before. So again, we want to vet with them that the appropriate CFM set points are in place and that they are matching the schedule, whether it's that ventilation minimum, heating minimum, max cooling, or even the unoccupied minimum, because an unoccupied minimum is an important item when you potentially might have a 24/7 air handling unit, but a good portion of the zones or whatever are intended to truly go unoccupied. So you want that damper to truly go closed. The simple thing about ambient lockouts on perimeter heat, having perimeter heat on when it's 65 degrees or 70 degrees out here in Wisconsin is a very weird thing, but just locking it out at 55 degrees is just a very simple thing. And even when perimeter heat is going on, does it come on simultaneously with the reheat, or a little bit ahead of it, or even opposite, which we are not proponents of. And then room sensors, again, utilizing the owner with that, right? What type of room sensor do you want? And right now, I think we're seeing more and more clients wanting to have almost like the cooler, warmer adjustment, but they don't want to display the actual temperature. Because when a person sees a number 71, they might have that being as a perception of cold because they keep their house at 73, right? So just not showing numbers and that. So again, it's a conversation that we would have, and the ruggedness to meet the application.
Occupancy sensors. So understanding, with an occupancy sensor that is provided by whom. And if a box goes into unoccupied conditions during the day, which we would call standby, so the room is typically in occupied mode and it goes unoccupied, understanding that versus evening times. What CFM do we go to mitigate subcooling? So just kind of talking through the different sequences and the different processes so that we're all understanding things the same way.
And I guess the next thing on the occupancy sensor, right, is there's also, it's on the next slide, right, is the occupancy sensor itself, right? I mean, are there multiple contacts on that occupancy sensor for the control contractor to jump onto? We're seeing more and more lighting integration. So can the control contractor just kind of go to the integration and find out the zone occupancy signal, you know, or the control contractor themselves might have to provide that occupancy sensor.
Right, and then is it worthy of even using an occupancy sensor? You know, sometimes we're having multiple customers these days talking about, hey, we've got 3 rooms or 3 exam rooms or 3 offices on one zone. And so all 3 of those rooms have to go unoccupied in order for that VAV box to go unoccupied. So, and especially if they've got, you know, a high rate of patients, or if those rooms are occupied very often, what sort of benefit is they're questioning the benefit of the limited unoccupied time.
Because there's virtually never not a person in one of those 3 rooms, right?
Right. So talking through that and understanding the use of their space and the benefits of this to their space.
And then this is just a sequence of operation, speaking to standby, which I thought was written very well. I'm going to indicate this was an example of copy pasting, but it was a good, almost technical instruction worthy sequence that got into some really good detail that the designer and the control people both showed, and it ended up working out very well.
Life safety dampers. This is a really good conversation to have at, you know, your kickoff meeting or at the controls page turn. Ideally, controls page turn is a good spot to talk about it. Who's controlling them? We have so many jobs in the past where we would be towards the end of the project and they'd be like, fire alarm would say controls is controlling them. Controls would say fire alarm's controlling them. They would both point to other people. So we talk about these things at the very beginning of the project now, because it is not always defined as it should be. So having a real understanding of who's controlling the smoke dampers, especially because they have to be controlled for fire alarm reasons, and they have to be controlled for control reasons. Anytime your air handler system is down, your dampers must be closed per
these 2 kind of code requirements. Now, Wisconsin or whatever, we move very slow, like
we talk
walk, but we talk fast. So we're still using 2015 or whatever, but it does indicate that, you know, if a smoke detector, duct smoke detector, does not have the ability to appropriately read smoke when there's no velocity past it, then, you know, the damper should close. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah.
So a couple conclusion statements here. You know, in summary, in preparing for a controls page turn, you really have to get intimate with the submittal, knowing it kind of in and out, researching it against the drawings. I mean, these are common tasks anyways. Sometimes your scope of work might actually require to review the submittal as part of reviewing all submittals, but you have to have a really good understanding, highlighting that and getting ready to put your comments back out to the team.
Right, putting your comments out to the team in advance of the meeting allows them the opportunity to prepare their feedback or alternate solutions even.
As that 3rd bullet indicates, the copy paster control contractors, I think they paint themselves into a corner, because I think a good commissioning provider, okay, not being jerks about it or whatever, are going to leverage saying, this is what you said you were going to do, so show me how you're going to do it. So the controls page turn is really giving them an opportunity to say, oh, maybe we really didn't mean that, right? So let's go and again, talk about it. Everyone's in the room, engineer, owner, and more often than not, we're closer to being on the same page than we are not.
Right. And typically one of these meetings is 2 to 3 hours. However, the building is, depending on the building, it could be a multitude of meetings. So you know, we document these not issues, but the comments, so that everybody can address them, and we utilize CX Alloy, but there's many platforms.
And again, the meeting is awareness, right? So that, again, we're not just making assumptions by what we read, Paris, France, Paris, Illinois,
Right.
you know, that we have a meaning behind those words, right? And because you can actually hear the passion of people behind their words.
You can.
And we have like zero passion when we give a
Oh, yeah.
presentation.
And obviously keeping the commissioning, the controls page for meeting under our control. So the commissioning provider should facilitate that meeting.
And what we kind of teased once as what we thought was like one of the worst page turns, even though it was probably one of the most fun, because the control contractor was just completely over their head. They answered every question wrong. They said, well, no, I do it this way and I do it that way. And even with the engineer in the room or whatever, it was like they had no intent of following the design intent. And the owner was there. And it was like, they walked out of that and were saying, we're sorry, this seems to be like the worst one ever. And they looked at us saying, no, this is like the best one ever, because we just didn't have this realization. So they just had a much bigger revelation on this, and even pertaining to that control contractor. So we did cut out a bunch of our slides or whatever, but we still ran about 45 minutes. I do see a couple of chats out there. I don't know, Liz, if you're doing that, or if I can actually click on the chats.
Well, you can click on them too, but there are no questions so
Oh,
far.
okay.
Oh, actually, here comes one. So are you typically reviewing or doing these page turns after the consultant has reviewed, approved, or maybe even rejected the controls drawing submittals?
I would say we let them. Again, I'm going to go, it depends on project delivery, right? But more often than not, we're reviewing them after even the designer reviewed them. But or maybe sometimes learning to do it more concurrently, because if we're doing it after, we're kind of sometimes poking the engineer in the eye, right? Because our comments might be more.
That's not the intent.
No, but because sometimes our comments are more scrutinous than potentially theirs, and it has people taking questions.
I mean, there's pros and cons for everything, and so depending on how thoroughly the engineer reviews it, also it can reduce the comments that come for the controls page turn as well. But it's a mix between reviewing concurrently with the engineer or reviewing after the engineer. Sometimes at whatever the preference of the engineer is.
We had a couple of questions come in. One, do you find buying coffee and donut ever helps?
I do more for a can of Mountain Dew and a bag of Cheetos, but depending on the time, no, I would completely agree that, it's almost like a peace offering. It loosens up the room or whatever. And, but people might also, because they know me, they might think that that's trying to, buy me off, but that won't count. I don't think we do that very often, but
it certainly can loosen up a room.
So in the chat, we have one more. And should you have a preliminary meeting with the engineer to avoid poking them in the eye and ignore your design review comments?
Go, Dave. It's your analogy.
We are seeing the benefits. Like we said, this was a short story and there were slides that we have taken out. With the IPD process and other similar things, with getting trade allies on board early, this page turn, doing it in its infancy during design even, provides great benefits to the point that we don't have to have these type of thorough conversations during construction. We typically still would, because there could be new players involved. But we are working more so to engage with the designers earlier.
Which that goes to Lee's question there too, the question that we're seeing where is the address for design review. True. And if you're able to review sequences, not so much the submittal with all of the schematics, but the sequences themselves, this certainly could be addressed at that time as well.
So we had one more come in. In your participation slide, there did not appear to be a balancer included. They should be included so balancing concerns are addressed. For example, tab access and any test modes to facilitate commissioning.
Yeah, I would say there's a fair number of times when we're doing this meeting that a balancer is not on, maybe selected yet. Not all the time. Sometimes they're selected early, but
Part of, I'm going to go part of our delivery on a project. We have them involved or we're involved in their pre-installation meeting, when they're getting ready to mobilize. And the page turn, you're actually saying something quite interesting, because they're not involved, and it doesn't on ours, and it doesn't take really that much to invite them.
No.
Really just as a courtesy that they could provide their insight, from again, access and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of the stuff that we're all looking through the whole construction verification process. But I really like this or whatever, because the balancer, the good ones, right? The good ones want to know necessarily how these systems work, right? Because sometimes you do have the balancers that, hey, I got, proportionally balanced 600 CFM, 200 a piece, and hey, that's great and stuff like that. But they don't necessarily know how it's working in conjunction with the, even the return VAV box or something like that. So,
but there are some of them who are really great troubleshooters as well, and assist with the process. And when you get into those like pharmacies and other more critical type spaces. So yeah, there are definitely opportunities where it certainly makes sense to.
I think they might be a future invitee to our page turn meetings. We usually don't forget people.
No.
And think of that, but we're also ones that have the right people in the room, right? And maybe we actually forgot about those, but we appreciate that insightfulness. We learned something too.
Absolutely.
Well, I thank you both for today. I appreciate your taking the time to do the Tech Talk and the Central Chapter for hosting this. I did send out in the chat the new password for all Tech Talks. I believe it should be coming to you in an email today. But the password is 22BCXA ! So you can watch this one recorded and all previous Tech Talks. Also want to do a quick reminder that we have our third webinar in the spring series coming up on May 9th, the level of confidence and risk mitigation. This is a continuation of one that Kent Barber did at the annual conference that got a lot of interest. So make sure you check that one out. But for now, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your support, and thank you, Dave and Rachel, for your time today.
It was enjoyable. We enjoyed this too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.